One of the greatest steam locomotives, Blue Peter is the sole surviving member of the LNER's Class A2 Pacifics, built to the design of Arthur Peppercorn. Our opening scene shows the engine near A's Gill on the famous Settle and Carlisle Railway, which has been her favourite stamping ground since she was reincarnated to bring pleasure to the travelling public once again. Her reincarnation in the 1990s followed the unceremonious elimination of mankind's most alive invention, the steam engine, from the nationalised British Railways in the 1960s. On the last day of 1966, locomotive number 60532 was withdrawn from service and would all too soon have joined her classmates in the scrapyards if it hadn't been for one Jeff Drury, a member of a select band of die-hard railway enthusiasts who couldn't bear to think that their beloved steam engines would soon be things of the past. Jeff Drury had one particular thing going for him that most enthusiasts hadn't. He had money, enough to purchase Blue Peter and her A4 predecessor Bittern. To him and a few others, we all owe an eternal debt. During the 1980s, a bunch of enthusiasts, rejoicing in the title of the North Eastern Locomotive Preservation Group, had restored a number of locomotives of the LNER to working order for use on the North Yorkshire Moors Railway, including the sole surviving Peppercorn Class K1 Mogul, which was certificated for use on the main lines. With this experience under their belts, they reached an agreement with Jeff Drury to take over the only other example of Peppercorn's work and set to work restoring Blue Peter to mainline standards. The results you can see here as the magnificent locomotive sets out from Blackburn to run over the Settle and Carlisle line on her maiden run on the 7th of March 1992. The engine had been passed for mainline running a few weeks previously, having been completed and run in on the North Yorkshire Moors Railway at the end of the previous year. Due to her sharing her name with the popular children's television programme, her return was national news, and enormous crowds turned out to witness this maiden run. Here she tackles the famous long drag on the S&C, 12 miles of unbroken climbing. After a water stop at Garsdale, the train was off again, and is seen next on the relatively level section of line high in the Cumbrian Mountains, just after the restart. Most runs over the S&C were one-way affairs in those days, and Blue Peter came off the train at Carlisle. She stayed there for 2 weeks and then headed south over the famous line once again, and is seen just to the north of Appleby, the first stop. On the basis of tractive effort, this locomotive could claim to be the most powerful British Pacific, and on these early turns it was pretty obvious that this was equally true in fact. This trip took a left turn at Hellifield and terminated at Bradford Forster Square, nearly back on home territory. After the train had been taken on by a diesel, the A2, with support coach in tow, ran up to Shipley to turn on the Triangle, prior to another rest, this time on the Keighley and Worth Valley Railway, where she undertook a few runs on service trains. After another 2-week break, Blue Peter returned to Bradford to take over another northbound train, destination Carlisle once again. This is the south to west side of the Shipley Triangle. This run was as immaculate as the first. Here she runs through the site of the old sidings at the summit of the line, A's Gill. We'll return here later. With her 6'2" driving wheels, the engine is very sure-footed, as this start away from Appleby on the second northbound run amply demonstrates. Only the size of the driving wheels differentiates the Class A2 design from Peppercorn's Class A1 Pacifics, and Blue Peter's return would unleash a desire to see one of her near twins run once again. None of the A1s survived the steam holocaust of the 1960s. They led ridiculously short lives, as all 50 were built in 1948 and 1949, immediately after the 15 A2s. However, history will show that there were 51 A1s built, but not when this scene was recorded. Such is the nostalgia for steam that Blue Peter would enter the third millennium with a near cousin, some 50 years younger than herself, as a brand new Class A1 was commissioned in the 1990s, with completion due in 2001. Such is the power that Blue Peter unleashed on her return in 1992. 1992 would see the engine confined to the Settle and Carlisle, at a time when the phrase summer steam ban and the name rail track had never been uttered. This is another northbound run. Neither June nor August would see steam on the main lines a few years hence. There are no records showing Blue Peter to be responsible for fires on the trips seen here. Perhaps a powerful engine on a relatively lightly timed work didn't really need to be worked flat out. Anyway, who said summers are dry? Here she approaches Shotlock Hill Tunnel on the same northbound train seen at Horton. At the end of the year, Blue Peter was on true LNER metals once again, as she spent the winter on a very different main line, the Great Central. Here she's seen at the then new terminus of Leicester North, built on the site of the old Belgrave and Birstall station. As she draws to a halt, it's an opportune time to recount the British Railways history of the A2 class and Blue Peter in particular. She was actually built by the nationalised concern, although it was simply actioning an outstanding LNER order. The latter had laid down frames for 15 locomotives at Doncaster Works in 1947, all except one of which were in the process of construction when British Railways came into existence on the 1st of January 1948. The LNER wanted 20 more, but BR cancelled these in May 1948. The first engine, works number 2016, was released to traffic on Christmas Eve 1947, the only member of the class to be a genuine LNER machine. Numbered 525, the name A.H. Peppercorn was bestowed on this engine, and full LNER apple green livery was applied. The same livery adorned the second engine, but subsequent ones had British Railways spelt out in full on the tenders. LNER numbers, with an E added, were borne by the first 7 engines, and the 8th was the first to sport the full BR number from the start. This was works number 2023, running number 60532, Blue Peter. Released to traffic on the 25th of March 1948, our hero was one of the very first engines of all to bear her BR number from new. Curiously, in her subsequent preservation career, before emerging on the main lines, she bore full LNER livery and the LNER number 532 for the first time in her life. Historically correct it wasn't. The next 6 engines were identical to Blue Peter and bore some odd names. She was followed by Happy Night and Irish Elegance. These aren't a celebration of sexual conquest or a dubious creamy liqueur, but the names of racehorses that had won the great classic races of the time. And Blue Peter wasn't named after the TV show. It seems to have been on forever, but even the BBC hadn't introduced it back in 1948. nor was it named after a flag, although the racehorse, the winner of the 1939 Derby, might have been. Some of the names of the other members of the class were really very attractive, such as Sun Chariot or Sea Gireo, if I've said it right. The final engine of the class would have a lasting effect on the appearance of Blue Peter. 60539 Bronzino was released to traffic in August 1948 with a feature that changed the look of the engine substantially. The first 14 had been built with single chimneys, a retrograde step for LNER Pacifics, all of which had had double chimneys from the time of Mallard onwards. Bronzino had one, and it was so effective that 5 more A2s received them at their first overhaul. Blue Peter was the first, returning to traffic on the 28th of September 1949 so fitted. Shortly after that, in November, she was reallocated from the shed that had been her first home, York, to Edinburgh's Haymarket shed. This was to be her salvation, as she became a Scottish engine for the rest of her life, and so escaped the devastating impact of dieselisation, which hit her English sisters in 1962, when Bronzino was withdrawn after a life of only 14 years. Blue Peter survived for another 4 years, as the Scottish region needed steam until the end of 1966, and she was thus still intact when Jeff Drury approached BR to acquire her. This took place on the 21st of August 1968, and the engine was then kept on a number of preserved railways, during which time the TV presenters found out they had a locomotive namesake. Thus the engine remained in the public eye throughout the 70s and 80s, and the announcement that it would return to the main lines in the 1990s was accompanied by much good publicity. Many of today's enthusiasts can truly be said to have grown up with Blue Peter.
Yep.
After the winter sojourn in Leicestershire, it was time for a return to the wilds of Cumbria. Here she braves the elements on the S&C as she heads up the grade through Kirkby Stephen on a southbound working. "218 1/4 miles from St Pancras Station is the little Yorkshire station of Cononley. Despite being in Yorkshire, this is a Midland station, on that railway's route to the north via Leeds and the Settle and Carlisle. On the same day, Blue Peter was to run fast through the station, before it was desecrated with wires for the Airedale electrification project. Celebrating a full year back on the main lines, the engine, appropriately, ran north on the S&C a few weeks later. Here she's on the flat stretch at the top again. But it was all getting a bit sameish. The next tour was on purely ex-LNER lines, out and back to Scarborough from York, her first home. Here she rounds the curves at Kirkham Abbey as the line follows the wanderings of the River Derwent. Scarborough trains normally had but one intermediate stop, at Moulton, which had, sadly, recently lost its overall roof. But this year was to see a major tour to Scotland. At last she'd come home. Travelling up via the Glasgow and South Western Main Line from Carlisle to Glasgow, the train had to skirt the southernmost parts of Glasgow to regain the metals where she had once been a star performer. This was at a time when British Rail still thought it was unsafe for steam engines to travel under their own power under electrified wires. Here we see the historic moment when Blue Peter ran onto the former Caledonian Main Line, which ran from Glasgow's Buchanan Street station via Perth to Aberdeen, on which ran the 3-hour trains of the mid-60s, the last trains which needed top-link express engines outside the southern region. These trains were the saviour of a number of A4s and 3 A2s, which were also needed for the fish trains, postal trains and some parcels traffic. Sayer Gireo and Hornet's Beauty kept Blue Peter company into 1966 here. The Caledonian Main Line metals from Buchanan Street are those coming in from the right behind the signal box. Blue Peter is standing on the connecting line to the better-known main line to the south and England. Of course, when in Scotland, you must visit that great wonder of the world, the Forth Bridge. You may have been puzzled by the sound of 2 whistles in this programme, but only seeing 1 engine. The explanation is simple. Blue Peter has got 2 whistles. The rather pathetic little one is the one she was born with. The rather more melodious one is an addition from North America. The latter has historic connections, since Sir Nigel Gresley fitted chime whistles to his A4 Pacifics after hearing one on the minute Romney Hythe and Dymchurch Railway, which had 2 American outline miniatures. BR perpetuated chime whistles on its Britannias and a few other engines, but Blue Peter has the only real American one in captivity. Perhaps the greatest performance of her preservation career was her return to Edinburgh Waverley, where she departed south-east for Glasgow. Glasgow? Isn't that west of Edinburgh? Yes. The train was routed all around Edinburgh via the sublines to minimise the running under the wires. At least BR had relented a little. The event was the centenary of the Edinburgh and Glasgow Railway, and the Pacific was sharing duties with her A4 predecessor, Union of South Africa, on a series of steam excursions between the 2 cities. The trains ran over Calumetals via Springburn. Her 3rd year back on the main lines started with yet more work on the S&C, whose charms haven't diminished yet. Here she leaves Carlisle after taking over the appropriately named North Eastern Rail Tour from her companion in the North Eastern Locomotive Preservation Group's stable, the K1. Nilpeg, to use the familiar abbreviation, though I haven't the foggiest idea what the E stands for, had decided that the engine wasn't getting a fair crack of the whip on rail tours, the market for which in 1994 was cracking wide open with the break-up of British Rail. They promoted this tour themselves and made a far better job of it than had been done before. The K1 had taken the train from Darlington up the East Coast Main Line, under the wires, via Newcastle and Hexham to Carlisle. Here the A2 took over for a trip over the S&C, back to Leeds. But what everyone wanted to see was Blue Peter back on the East Coast Main Line. At the end of 1994, the dream came true. She became the first steam engine to work a public tour down the main line from Edinburgh and Newcastle. But the dream became a nightmare. As can be seen from this rare footage taken by one of our viewers from the back of the train, the start, after an unscheduled stop at Durham, was the usual sure-footed getaway as the engine pulled away over the viaduct to the south of the station. But what happened now has become the stuff of legend. The engine lost its feet as it came off the viaduct, and the inexperienced crew was unable to control it. It's been estimated that the wheels revolved at the equivalent of 140 miles an hour, a record no one really wants to claim. After the horror of Durham, the engine was towed to Thornaby Depot, where the damage was assessed at £50,000 plus. BR took some of the blame and contributed much of the cost. But Blue Peter became the first true casualty of the second golden age of steam. Could she be repaired? Nelpeg's dedicated team set to with a will. She would return to the main lines. Paul Hutchinson explained what happened to us.
The incident occurred on the 1st of October when we were working from Edinburgh to York on the East Coast Main Line. We'd stopped at Durham to drop off a couple of passengers, and on pulling away and clearing the viaduct, the loco started an extremely violent slip which proved impossible to control. The loco slipped for 35 seconds before the regulator was shut, and in that time the two outside sets of valve gear totally disintegrated, attempting to lock the outside wheels. The inside valve gear remained more or less intact with one or two bent rods, but was still trying to drive the locomotive forwards. This resulted in the left-hand leading wheel moving on the axle, which is the major problem with the restoration. We've searched the country basically to find a press which can remove the wheel. The problem is compounded by the fact that it's a crank axle. There's only very limited clearance between the back of the wheel and the crank webs. Hopefully we've found somewhere that can rectify that problem now and remove the wheel so it can be replaced in the correct position. After the incident, the loco remained stranded on the main line for 2.5 hours while the remains of the valve gear were dismantled or made safe. Once that was done, the stock and the loco were pulled back into Durham station so the stock could be disposed of, and later on that evening the loco was towed to Darlington station where it remained overnight. The next day it was towed here to Thornaby, where it's remained ever since. We started work on dismantling the locomotive almost immediately. The facilities here are absolutely excellent and are ideal for doing the work that we've got to do. I've got to say as well that the depot staff here have been absolutely superb and made us feel most welcome, and always show keen interest in what we're doing, as well as offering any physical help that they're able to offer as well.
Well, this is our pile of parts. As Paul said earlier, there's about 30% of the 100 or so major items that are taken off which need to be repaired or replaced. And so this pile would actually be bigger than this. Some of them were being repaired. Over on the pallet there are the two front axle boxes, which weigh a phenomenal amount, believe you me. They're to go away to the Bluebell Railway to be remetalled and machined. Towards the wall there's the scrap valve heads, which are now, as I say, scrap. New ones are being made for those. They've been replaced. And then there are other parts of the valve gear which can be seen. The two cylinder covers are there, which are okay. Unlike the centre one, which was cracked, the two outside ones are okay. They're going to go back straight on as soon as we're ready to put them on. And missing from this pile are things like the crossheads, which had to go to a firm in Middlesbrough to be white metal, along with the valve crossheads. They've then gone up to Stanley in County Durham to be machined. The eccentric, which is white metal at the same time, the eccentric strap, that's gone to Butterley to be machined. And all this is because all the facilities are no longer under one roof. You've got to go where you can find people that do these jobs.
Smashed and bent motion parts tell their own stories.
Yeah. Right, these are the turn platform, right hand side, and the radius rod right hand side. You can see the radius rod got broken into. Both Martin and I were on the train when the incident occurred, and I think we both agree that it was rather a sickening experience. The thing that really upset me about it, more than the physical damage to the loco, was the fact that a good few of our volunteers, probably 30 or 40 different people, spent 5 years restoring this locomotive, and to see it be well and truly wrecked in 35 seconds, knowing that the hearts and souls of our volunteers had gone into the restoration was devastating.
At the end of the, well, not the end, but towards the end of the incident in Durham, we were waiting for the other main line to be cleared so that we could work on the set of valve gear. And somebody thought about giving the crew a cup of tea, because they're both in some state of shock, really, quite understandably. A terrifying experience for everybody. Somebody offered the driver and fireman a cup of tea, and as the fireman climbed out of the cab, he said to me, and as he handed me the footplate brush, he said, "I've swept up for you."
In the course of dismantling the engine, we've taken off over 100 major components. About 30% of these are damaged, either beyond repair or are capable of being repaired. As we've stripped the loco down, we've found more and more damage that we didn't originally cater for in our estimates, and it seemed that the probable cost of repair now is going to be in the region of £45,000. We'd originally estimated about 30,000.
Some 20 months after the Durham incident, Blue Peter was a prime mover once again. returning to the moors on the 31st of May 1996. On the 21st of July, she backed down through the tunnel at Gromont in order to take a train of passengers over the full length of the line. The North Yorkshire Moors Railway, or Moors Line, is the spiritual and physical home of Nelpeg, who have their own workshops at Gromont. Not surprisingly, in view of the severity of the damage, it was announced that the engine would not return to the main lines unless certain preconditions were met. Nelpeg's trust would have to be won back, even though there was still a 2.5-year period of mainline certification available. Our final view sees the engine rounding the curve at Darnholm, a test of any engine. Nelpeg's trust was won back, and Blue Peter did return to the main lines, still the favourite of so many. Will our sequel feature her double heading with Tornado, the new 51st A1, and possibly the last Peppercorn locomotive to be built?
Since this programme was made, Blue Peter has continued service into the new millennium. It has drawn crowds in virtually every corner of the UK, either on the main line or, as here, on various preserved railways, the Swan, the Bowness and Kinnell Railway in Scotland. It's appropriate we see Blue Peter in Scotland once more, as she ended her days in BR times based at Dundee, from where she was used extensively until the end of steam in Scotland in December 1966. Blue Peter was also used on numerous specials, which took her to such far-flung places as Exeter and Holyhead. Her final rail tour took her over the Waverley route and Beatock. Blue Peter's preserved mainline ticket finally expired in September 2001. In the last year of operation, she was centrepiece to a memorial train in April 2000 to commemorate the life of her saviour, Geoff Drury, who sadly died a few months previously. From there she was to be seen on the Settle Carlisle again, and at the Crew Works Open Day in the May. In the July of 2000, Blue Peter made her first trip to Swansea, and performed well along the Welsh coast route, arriving to a large crowd. The following week took the locomotive to Yeovil for an open day, after which a Pathfinder tour witnessed her storming Hatton Bank, arriving at Stratford on time. final views of Blue Peter are on its home railway, the Moors Line, where she ended her current term of operation. In 2000, on the 13th of August, the Pacific departed King's Cross once more for a run up the East Coast Main Line to York. Into 2001, Blue Peter received an intermediate repair for a busy few months of operation ahead. The locomotive would be seen at work on the Moors Line a good deal, even longer than at first thought, as an extension of her boiler certificate ensued. Number 60532's farewell to the main line took place on the 9th of June 2001, with the engine performing well over Shap Summit, with a 13-coach train and 2 Class 31 diesels attached at the rear. She ran over 5,000 miles in her last season in traffic on the Moors Line and has been sadly missed since her withdrawal. Fundraising by Nelpeg of £65,000 in the late 1980s brought us Blue Peter in the early 1990s to our main lines. Let's hope that it won't be too long before she's seen again, storming the long drag and the climb out of Gromont on the Moors Line.